Hi, welcome back to Make It With Tim. As you guys know by now, I love to make things, I love to fix things. And at the moment, I'm in the middle of doing up a brand new house that my wife and I bought recently. If you like the sound of this and you want to follow along the journey, please click the subscribe button below and hit the like. Now, in today's project, I'm going to be showing you how to put up a floating shelf and not only put it up, but alter it so that it fits where you want it to go. Now for me, this means this corner. It means taking this shelf in so that it fits within this and the front door can open properly. And also my wall wasn't exactly flat, so I had to shape the back, making sure that it fitted in perfectly. My wife and I were very generously given a couple of floating shelves by a work colleague. Now I wanted to put one of them up here, next to the front door. The problem was that it was too deep for the alcove that we have. So I've had to trim it and resort the back so that it would still fit onto the metal brackets. And I've also had to cut the edge because the corner here isn't 90 degrees. If I hadn't sorted the edge out, it wouldn't be flush against the edge here and I'd have a gap of 5 to 10 mil between the shelf and the wall. Now, for some of you that won't be a problem. For me, I wanted to sort it, so let me show you how I did it. I start by taking the shelf and putting it into the corner where I want it to hang. Now you can see here, it's too big for the space. So if I turn the shelf over, I can now make a mark on the shelf against where the wall finishes. I then use my adjustable set square to take the measurement for the mark that I have just made on the shelf. Now laminate has a tendency to snap and break when you cut it, so the finish doesn't look too good. So to help prevent this happening, I've wrapped masking tape around the line where I'm going to be cutting. I then use my adjustable set square to the measurement I've just set to reapply the marks for my cut. Another trick to help with a nice finish to the cut on laminate is to turn the shelf upside down. So you're cutting from the bottom. This is because of the direction of the blade. It will cut up into what is the top of the shelf, and that side should then look good for you. If any part of the laminate is going to fracture, it will be the underside of the shelf, which is the top bit that is facing you when you cut with a circular saw or a plunge saw. I need to save the back bit of the shelf because this is an important structural component. So I had to take off all the wood and veneer around the outside, all the staples that were holding it in place, and then sand it down so that it was exactly the right size to fit back into the back of the shelf. I then used my adjustable set square again to take the measurement of the depth of this back bit of the shelf. I then used that measurement to work out how much of the internal support structure of the shelf I needed to remove to allow me to refit this back section of the shelf inside the shelf so that it was nice and flush. Once I think I've removed enough of the insides, I double check with that adjustable set square. After a very quick test fit to make sure the structure of the back of the shelf fits in, I then need to mark up the structure of the back of the shelf so that I can trim it to the right width to fit inside the shelf itself. As you can see here, I like to use a line with a little V tick marking the side of the line that I need to cut. I then line it up on my chop saw and cut along the line. Now it's good practice to make sure that your chop saw blade stops before you then lift the blade and remove the wood. Once I had trimmed both ends, it was then time to dry fit it into the back of the shelf. After making sure the structural back of the shelf fitted into the shelf nice and flush, it was then time to glue up. So I got my wood glue and I put it round the structural back of the shelf, made sure it is spread nice and evenly, and then put some wood glue on the internal structure of the shelf as well. I then put my clamps on and waited for the wood glue to dry. In an ideal world, I'd have a few more clamps than I have here, but this seemed to work for this project. While the wood glue was drying, I needed to cut down the internal metal supports so that they fitted the newly sized shelf. I shortened the internal length of the metal supports by the same amount that the shelf was shortened. To do this, I used a grinder with a metal chopping disc and then switched it out for a grinding disc. You could also use a hacksaw and files for the same job, depending on what you have to hand. Once the wood glue was dry, I used a protractor to find the exact angle I needed to cut the shelf. I dragged it along the edge of the wall while drawing on the shelf when the shelf was in position. This way, I got the exact angle I needed to make the shelf fit into that corner. After this, I took it to my chop saw, changed the angle to match the line, and then cut. If you have a circular saw, you could always use that to make this cut. If you need to know how to make a jig for your circular saw to make nice straight cuts, I'll put a link up here and also down below. I then repeated the process for the back of the shelf because my wall wasn't perfectly flat. To make this cut, I used my plunge saw because the lines I needed to cut were pretty much straight. There was very little curve to them. If your wall is bumpier or more curved than mine, you could use your jigsaw instead. Don't forget to make these cuts from the back of the shelf. That way the top of the shelf will have a beautiful cut, and if there's any tear out, it will be on the underneath side that you don't see. Because of the amount I needed to trim my shelf, I can't reuse the screw holes that were already there and they weren't cut off. So I'm going to use some of the veneer from the cut off to plug the holes before drilling some new holes through the screws. Once I had cut the veneer plugs, I sanded them down to size and stuck them in with some wood glue. While the veneer plugs were drying, I measured up for the new screw holes to match the holes that were already in the metal supports. Again, I used my adjustable set square to get the measurement so that I could transfer it from the metal supports onto the bottom of the shelf. To make the holes, I used my countersink with a drill bit in it. This way the screws would sit nice and flush with the bottom of the shelf and not stick out. I then rolled up a piece of very fine sandpaper and used it just to smooth out any rough edges. Once I was happy with the screw holes, I did a test fit with the metal frame to make sure that it all went together as I expected. Now the shelf is ready to fit, and I need to take measurements of exactly where the back plate is in relation to the shelf, so that I can mark these onto the wall before drilling the holes to fix my back plate to the wall. I positioned my shelf exactly where I wanted it, and made sure that it was level. I then made a couple of very light marks on the wall to indicate exactly where the shelf was going to be sitting. After this, I took the shelf away and used the measurements that I had already taken to mark out exactly where the back plate was going to sit. I used these marks and a spirit level to position my back plate, and then drew onto the wall exactly where the holes were that I needed to drill out. I then made a quick check of the wall to make sure I wasn't going to be drilling into any electrics or pipe work, chose my raw plug, checked which size drill piece I needed, and then taped up my drill piece to mark the depth of my screws. Before drilling, I made sure that my drill was on a hammer setting so that it made easy work of the masonry. If you don't have this setting or a specific hammer drill, you will find drilling into masonry hard work. I then popped in my raw plugs and attached the shelf plate to the wall. While attaching my back plate, I used the spirit level just to double check that everything really was level. I then tried fitting my floating shelf, and I discovered that I needed to pack out the centre of my base plate because my wall wasn't quite straight as I already knew. I then refitted the shelf and found everything fitted a lot better. Once the shelf was in place, I put in the 2 locator screws to make sure everything fitted as I expected. I then took out these 2 locator screws so that I could decorate the shelf. That meant putting in the phone, wiring it up, and making sure that where I'd put the shelf didn't interfere with the door handle as planned. So there you have it. You've seen exactly how I go about altering a floating shelf and putting it up against a wall that isn't exactly flat and into a corner that isn't a perfect 90 degrees. Now, I hope that you found this really helpful, and at the very least I hope that you've enjoyed it. So if you've enjoyed this video and you want to carry on watching the other DIY projects I do around the house, then please click the subscribe button below. If you haven't, and if you have already, thank you very much. Hit the like button and leave me a comment about your experiences of putting up floating shelves. So till next time, take care and God bless.